In setting out his program for a sociology of language, Bill Labov positioned what he called the vernacular as the central unit of linguistic analysis. From a disciplinary standpoint, this marked a radical departure from the theoretical and Chomskyan approaches of the day, which relied primarily on a linguist interrogating their own intuitions about language in order to describe language. Labov instead shifted linguistic analysis in the direction of natural speech, casual speech occurring in conversation, and in terms of the speech community being the element of language use where language was studied, rather than a researcher interrogating their own language within their own brains in consciously monitored situations. Labov framed the vernacular as a speaker's essential speech, the speech that they used in unmonitored, unself-conscious situations and in social contexts like with close friends and loved ones when they could, in Labov's conceptualization, speak naturally. Labov's framing of the vernacular importantly recognized what we intuitively know, that there is no such thing as a single-style speaker, someone who always speaks the same way in all situations. And this is a linguistic universal, which Labov recognized and made central in linguistic research. That speakers vary in their register, their vocabulary, their standardness, their correctness. And for Labov, positioning the vernacular, what was ostensibly the least intentionally correct, the least standard, and the least careful as the core domain of linguistic analysis, dramatically shifted the way that linguists would go about thinking about language, conceptualizing it, and gathering data. Within this framing, recognizing the vernacular as the key type of language that a linguist needs to interrogate to describe that language, the linguist's job became to negotiate among the varying levels of style and the different types of style that speakers had access to, and navigating down toward their vernacular so that we could capture samples of vernacular speech and report on vernacular speech and base our linguistic descriptions and linguistic analyses on the vernacular. Labov recognized a fundamental irony. The nice thing about being a Chomskyan linguist of the time and just thinking about what you thought was it was pretty easy to capture data. It's not so easy to capture data when you're going into a speech community and capturing samples of speech from other people. In particular, when the speech that you're trying to capture is unmonitored, unself-conscious speech, Labov recognized that any method that called attention to language would inherently interfere with a speaker's ability to use their unmonitored, unself-conscious level of speech. Labov drew on concepts from laboratory sciences like biology and physics to articulate the observer's paradox. This concept in laboratory sciences acknowledged that when we take a measurement, when we make an observation on something we're studying, we necessarily interfere with that thing and influence the measurement that we take. Labov positioned this as a fundamental concept of dialectological and sociolinguistic research, recognizing that when we practice the act of eliciting linguistic data from someone, we inherently affect the language that they use. And specifically in the context of trying to seek the vernacular, trying to seek unself-conscious, unmonitored speech, we would force someone to use conscious, monitored speech through our act as linguists of trying to elicit data from them. Labov therefore developed instrumental techniques, all aimed at moving toward the vernacular, all aimed at finding ways to elicit linguistic data without making people realize that we are eliciting linguistic data, or to elicit data in such a way that at some points speakers forget that data is being elicited from them, so they can forget that they're being observed, and we can have as little impact on the data that we're collecting as possible. In other words, Labov's principles and methods that were articulated and demonstrated and exemplified in the early days of sociolinguistic research, and which have become foundational tools for sociolinguists and for dialectologists, were all aimed at causing speakers to forget that they were being monitored, so that the act of monitoring wouldn't cause them to monitor themselves, and in doing so shift away from the vernacular and shift toward a more conscious, more monitored, more careful style of speech. The first of his methods was the rapid and anonymous survey, and Labov exemplified the rapid and anonymous survey in his famous New York City department store study, where he walked through department stores asking employees where things were located in the store, knowing that they would elicit the response 4th floor, and then pretending that he had not heard them, so they would say 4th floor again. The point of a rapid and anonymous survey is to rapidly collect a large number of responses to a single variable. I say a single variable because it's typical when conducting a rapid and anonymous survey that we only look at a single variable. This is actually a matter of necessity, because during a rapid and anonymous survey we'll have a very limited capacity to capture details of responses, and it's very difficult to attend to multiple variables if we're trying to impressionistically code them and remember for some amount of time what someone said. So we limit to a single variable in order to make the data manageable and get reasonably accurate impressionistic transcriptions, codings of what people say in response to our survey questions. It's typical to ask someone a question that you have a reasonable suspicion, a reasonable expectation will produce some response that includes the variable that you're looking for. So in the case of a variable like th fronting in Britain, we could ask what time it is around 3 o'clock, and with the knowledge that that would produce responses like 3, 3:30, maybe half 3 if it's not quite 3 yet, 15 minutes till 3, whatever, we have a reasonable expectation that the variable that we're interested in would be produced. A researcher doing a rapid and anonymous survey typically listens to the person's response and just impressionistically codes it. Researchers will often capture basic demographic data only of the sorts of things that we can normally take in as impressions of people, social characteristics like rough age or outward projections of gender, and these might also be noted along with our transcriptions and codings of the variables that we're interested in. Crucially, is an ethical issue that I'll address later on. Nothing is audio or video recorded in a rapid and anonymous survey. This was true in Labov's day and remains true now, as we have much stricter ethical obligations as researchers internationally and specifically within an EU framework. Researchers conducting a rapid and anonymous survey have to remain conscious of the extent to which they're being observed. It's obviously problematic if you ask someone what time it is, they say 3 o'clock, and then they see you go to someone else and ask them the same question. On one level, this can lead to invalidating data because people become aware that they're being monitored, which undoes the whole point of the rapid and anonymous survey. On a higher level, this can lead to a researcher being confronted because they are doing something surreptitious and getting people to give a response for a reason that is disingenuous compared to what people think that they're responding to. Labov complements the rapid and anonymous survey with the sociolinguistic interview. The sociolinguistic interview, by contrast, is a formal, structured genre of interview with the intention of varying the amount of speech consciously and in a structured way that an informant is paying across the interview. In Labov's framing, the idea was that a rapid and anonymous survey would be a way to complement a sociolinguistic interview and vice versa. So you would use a rapid and anonymous survey to quickly gather a large amount of data about a single variable, and then you would do focused study on a wider range of variables and on that variable, and with richer demographic information through the sociolinguistic interview. If you're thinking about the goal of capturing unmonitored self-conscious speech, but also understanding how sociological factors and demographic factors are interacting with linguistic productions, it becomes easy to understand why these two instrumental techniques were complementary approaches. The rapid and anonymous survey has the advantage of collecting a huge amount of information with a very low likelihood of conscious monitoring or self-consciousness to speech. So the rapid and anonymous survey in Labov's conceptualization was a way to capture the vernacular. However, you couldn't capture lots of the vernacular because you were only getting a single item from speakers. You couldn't capture any demographic information besides what from seeing a person in the street or in a public setting. And so the sociolinguistic interview complemented the rapid and anonymous survey by sacrificing some of the unself-consciousness, sacrificing some of the free of monitoring quality that the rapid and anonymous survey would have, but then providing a very rich tapestry of linguistic variables, repeated utterances of the same variable, and all the demographic information that a researcher would need to collect. So for Labov, the sociolinguistic interview and the rapid and anonymous survey are complementary approaches to moving toward the vernacular and moving toward unconscious, unself-monitored speech, that we also understand how it occurs and the ways it occurs within a sociological fabric of a speech community. I highlight on this slide that the sociolinguistic interview is a genre of interview. And that means, and this is important from a disciplinary historical standpoint, that the sociolinguistic interview is not just an interview. Sociolinguistic interview is not just talking to people casually, but it's actually a program of moving someone across various styles of speech, specifically so that we get some speech at the vernacular range, we get some speech at the most self-conscious, most self-monitored range, and we examine stylistic variation across that continuum. The typical pattern to move from vernacular to formal and monitored high attention to speech tasks is to start the interview in a space that will elicit relatively casual, relatively unmonitored speech, and then over the course of the interview steadily increase the amount of speech that tasks of the interview demand of a speaker. In the Labovian framework, a sociolinguistic interview is a structured instrument. So he would use the same instrument, the same schedule of questions, and the same schedule of tasks for every interview and follow them quite rigidly. This was important and foundational to his approach, and is actually, in thinking about the sociolinguistic interview as a genre, a fundamental aspect of the sociolinguistic interview as a way to get toward Labov's concept of the vernacular. In practice, most sociolinguists today work with a more casual form of semi-structured interview, where you have a plan for some questions, but then also a fairly liberal allowance for allowing interviewees to move the interview in different directions. We often do this on the grounds that allowing the interview to move freely will elicit more casual, more vernacular, more unconscious, self-monitored speech. However, it's important to distinguish the way that we often do things now in a semi-structured way from what Labov really intended the sociolinguistic interview to be, which was a structured program to move someone from the vernacular to high attention to speech tasks. And even when doing semi-structured interviews, it's really important to have that touchstone in the structured interview. It's important to have a schedule of questions and a number of things that we mean to ask as a practical expedient, just because it's actually a lot harder to conduct an interview and to get the kinds of information that you think you need than you think it will be when you start doing interview work. And more importantly, because we need to make sure we capture consistent types of information across all of our interviewees so that we can do good, reliable comparisons of interview data across data sets. John Baugh reviewed the concept of the sociolinguistic interview as a genre of interview and provided 10 goals that are exemplified in Labov's early work. The first of these was to record with reasonable fidelity, so this means that during a sociolinguistic interview we have some kind of recording going on, and indeed Labov in his early work used tape recordings. This differentiates it, of course, from either the Chomskyan evaluations of grammar or Labov's work in the Rapid Anonymous Survey, which would not be captured and would only be capturing our impressionistic coding of people's response. Next, the sociolinguistic interview seeks to capture a full range of demographic data necessary to a study, and in Labov's instrument provided as an appendix to his 1966 New York City study, there's indeed two sections of demographic data that capture socioeconomic data as well as background on language data, and background on immigration to the city. Moreover, Labov in his work based the interviewees that he sought out to interview on a sociological survey of the Lower East Side of Manhattan. So Labov also had a richer set of knowledge about his informants' socioeconomic backgrounds, work, and that sort of thing. Again, though, this is differentiated from other types of collection where we won't have an extensive knowledge of an informant's social or economic or other demographic factors of their background. A sociolinguistic interview attains comparable answers across interviewees, so we can look ideally at a number of our informants' responses and see how they responded to similar types of prompts. Sociolinguistic interview in the Labovian frame seeks to elicit narratives of personal experience. So we have tasks that cause people to say how they do things and what they've done, and to talk about specific points in their lives in structured ways. The sociolinguistic interview seeks to stimulate group interaction among people. This has become much more sophisticated since Labov's work, and interviewers routinely work in interview dyads or small group settings now as a way to stimulate group interaction. In the initial Labovian framework of the sociolinguistic interview, this was often just a matter of creating opportunities for the person who is being interviewed to talk to other people around. So, for instance, if someone called on the phone while the interview was happening, Labov would let the interview continue, but actually what it would consist of is that person answering the call and Labov continuing to take the recording and then analyze it later while the person was talking to that person on the phone. More on that later when we get to research ethics and our navigation of the observer's paradox. The sociolinguistic interview seeks to isolate topics of great interest. For Labov's framing, this is topics of particular interest in regard to our linguistic study. So Labov was especially interested in phonetic and phonological data, so he had a number of variables that were meant to solicit comment on New York City pronunciations. The sociolinguistic interview seeks to trace patterns of communication so that we know who the interviewee, the informant, is talking to, and that is meant to give an idea of the ways that language might be spreading. Again, this has become much more complex since Labov's framing of the sociolinguistic interview, and even in Labov's own work that he conducted with research partners in African American communities in New York, separate from the better-known New York City studies that are captured in the Social Stratification of English in New York City. Labov looked much more at networks of people to understand who was friends with whom, who considered others friends, but were not separately considered friends by those people, who the popular members of groups were, the core members of group, the external satellite members of groups, and this understanding that eventually came to be more central to network analysis and to approaches to sociolinguistics, variationist studies, and dialectology that understand the ways people talk to each other as shaping their language and being important to study. Nevertheless, even in Labov's early work, at least consciously and explicitly identifying how people talk to others and who people talk to communicate with other groups was still important. The sociolinguistic interview seeks to obtain a record of overt attitudes toward language. So Labov has an entire section of his study where he asks people what they think about accents in New York City and asks them to give their thoughts about particular New York City pronunciations. We often now combine approaches from perceptual dialectology to achieve this task. For instance, giving someone a map, asking them to write where people speak different from them, as you do in a perceptual dialectology task. But along with that, asking them as part of the interview to say how people talk in those areas, what makes people different, perhaps even how much experience and exposure they have to that. So in doing so, they're giving us their attitudes toward language in those areas and among those groups. The sociolinguistic interview means to seek information about specific linguistic structures that we care about. So there will typically be items that expressly test whether a construction is considered grammatical or acceptable, or whether a pair of words sounds the same or different, if those are the sorts of words we're studying. Again, Labov was especially interested in New York City and phonetic and phonological data, so he had minimal pairs items and asked people to respond to them and record them so that he was able to capture phonetic data and extrapolate toward reasoning about their phonological systems on the basis of those minimal pairs. And finally, sociolinguistic interview is meant to be an opportunity to carry out field experiments that extract reactions. Labov played clips of New Yorkers reading a passage and asked informants to respond to them and rate the speaker as if they were being interviewed for a job, and then make a determination on the basis of that interview whether they would hire them for a job like being a professional newscaster or a more working class job that didn't have standing as requiring standard speech, being a language gatekeeper, all the way down to they wouldn't hire them. And in doing that task, as part of the sociolinguistic interview, they were able to capture, reflect their ideologies about how they responded to their own variety of language, and then extrapolate toward analyses of language attitudes. Specifically, in the case of Labov's early work, this generated the framing of linguistic security, which has been important to sociolinguistic work ever since. So, crucially, a good sociolinguistic interview will do of these things, and the interview itself will be structured to allow all of these tasks to be accomplished, including even the last, that we do some kind of experimentation with our subjects in this field setting. At this point, Labov identified 4 contexts of attention and self-monitoring interview tasks were likely to elicit. The goal, of course, in terms of achieving monitoring of the vernacular or capturing the vernacular, was context A, which Labov labeled as casual speech. Importantly, this speech was generally not actually interview speech. So context A, what Labov considered casual speech, was speech that the interviewees, the informants, happen to use outside of responding to questions. So in this case, speech outside the formal interview means things like when the person greets the interviewer, as the informant finishes up the interview and you do some chit-chat before moving on with your lives. Labov would consider that casual speech and differentiate that from other interview tasks. Labov really liked it when there was a phone call or an interruption during an interview, so that Labov could monitor how the person interviewed interacted with that person who was not part of the interview task. And for Labov, that was vernacular. That was the kind of unconscious, unmonitored speech. And then Labov also liked speech that was not in direct response to questions. So this is a little bit more in the realm of unstructured speech or semi-structured interview speech, as in the person has answered a question and then starts to talk on something else, or maybe you begin to engage in a discussion about sports and then move back to the more formal research task. Labov liked these, and these were casual speech, and crucially, in the Labovian sociolinguistic interview, these were not types of speech that were actually produced by the interview itself. So really anything the person said as a response to a question in the sociolinguistic interview was not context A. It would actually be elsewhere in his breakdown. Context A, casual speech, was speech that you happen to luck into outside of the interview itself. The only exceptions to this were what Labov has as A4 and A5 types of casual speech, which are childhood rhymes and customs that were elicited as part of the survey instrument, or responses to Labov's famous fear of danger or death question when he asked interviewees whether there was ever a time in their life where they were in so much danger that they feared they would die. Labov assessed the responses to these types of prompts to be so personal, so emotionally engaged, that speakers forgot that they were undergoing an interview, and in those moments, even though it was happening in response to an interview question, Labov treated those responses as context A, casual speech. Next, in the level of formality is interview speech, and this is where a person is responding directly to a question in an interview. Now, an important point here is that I think I'm on safe grounds in saying that most sociolinguists and most dialectologists working within the paradigm of the sociolinguistic interview no longer make a distinction between context A and context B, casual speech. But for Labov's purposes, if a person was responding to a question from an interviewer, they were not giving casual speech, they were doing careful speech, which they would still be monitoring and would still be subject to sociolinguistic change as a result of monitoring. The next level up in formality, context C, was reading style. So this is the interviewee would be given a passage or sentences to read and respond to them. Next, and almost at the peak of formality and peak of attention to speech, was word lists, where informants read a list of words out loud, strictly for pronunciation. And then finally, DIVA, or the highest level of self-monitoring, was minimal pairs, where an informant was reading two words and making a conscious judgment about whether they sounded the same or different. Now, what should be clear here is Labov's effort to move from unmonitored, unself-conscious speech to monitored, self-conscious speech. So the idea here is that these are discrete tasks that the sociolinguistic interview is structured to move a person through. So even the act of moving into the interview and kind of having the chat before you really get the interview started is a way to create a situation where casual speech happens. Then there's a series of questions designed to elicit fairly open responses, and those will elevate attention to speech a little bit and move into context B, because the interviewee, the informant, will know that they're responding to questions and will therefore be monitoring their answers, and in monitoring their answers, monitoring their language, and therefore will be speaking a little more closely. Context C shifts the person into an actual language task, reading and reading out loud, which might even have further layers of linguistic consciousness, as the person might be conscious of readings that they had to do in school, and kind of a school marmy task where you're reciting out loud and are aware of being judged for your language. Then in context D, we're explicitly asking the person to comment on their language, so they're naturally thinking about language, they're thinking about their own language, and are at the highest level in the Labovian framework of attention to speech. As I said, most researchers today don't distinguish too carefully between Labov's careful speech tasks, contexts, and his casual speech tasks and contexts. For Labov, however, and as a matter of disciplinary history, these were carefully differentiated, and indeed Labov has a decision tree for categorizing whether something is careful speech or casual speech, and the different types of responses and different types of interview language that would be categorized in either of these. Baugh visualizes the ways that different types of questions that might occur within a sociolinguistic interview interact with each other, and this is useful as a way to thinking about the different types of information and the different types of sociological encoding that might come with different types of stories, different types of responses, different types of reflections on events, how they will intersect and have varying levels of socialness, formality, casualness, and this sort of thing. Labov's instrument for his famous New York City study is available as an appendix, and this is a normal convention within sociolinguistic and dialectological studies to include the interview instrument, and we will use this as a model as we develop our own sociolinguistic instruments for interviews. Labov's framing of the vernacular as the central unit of linguistic analysis and his development of instrumental techniques like the rapid and anonymous survey, and even more so the sociolinguistic interview, were revolutionary within linguistics. Sociolinguistics exists as a field because of Labov's work, and the sociolinguistic interview is still widely and routinely used as the foundational document of sociolinguistic work, and for dialectologists who typically work in sociolinguistic frames, and vice versa, sociolinguists who in many cases are doing dialectological work. The sociolinguistic interview remains the core approach and a core methodology to methods across these disciplines. As you'd expect, though, researchers have pointed out many issues with the sociolinguistic interview. Of particular importance is Labov's framing of the vernacular. Kara Becker points out that Labov fundamentally assumes that the vernacular is the same thing as casual speech, and casual speech is the same thing as non-standard usage. And in doing so, Becker is summarizing a long list of objections to assumptions that underlie the concept of the vernacular as the element that linguists are trying to research. Leslie Milroy and Matt Gordon point out that the vernacular as the object of study is inherently unattainable because we don't know when we've actually found it. Indeed, Labov's work very quickly can get into an element of circular reasoning. How do you know when you've reached vernacular speech? You know you've gotten there because people are speaking casually and are not monitoring themselves. How do you know that people are speaking unselfconsciously and not monitoring themselves? Because they're using the vernacular. The vernacular does not exist objectively. We have no idea when someone is using the vernacular as it's been framed by Labov. Moreover, there's not actually a one-to-one correlation in practice with topic areas which are essential to Labov's structuring of the sociolinguistic interview, and actually achieving a priori, inherently casual or careful speech. Probably the best example of this is the fear of death and dying question, which for Labov was the ultimate best question to get someone to speak naturally and unselfconsciously in response to an interview prompt. His experience of results and responses to this question were that people would become so emotionally engaged with their responses to this as they recalled the terrifying events that they experienced, that they would lose the ability, they would forget that they were in the interview task and no longer monitor their own speech. But actually, we know that when people have important events, like you would think something that caused someone to fear for their life would be, that they often fossilize their narrative, and that event of telling that story becomes a routine speech event, something like a genre in and of itself. And so actually the type of response that you're likely to get from something like the fear of death and dying question could be a very conventionalized response, something that someone has practiced and rehearsed and told people many times that has become kind of fixed in their minds. This is problematic because, again, this was the question that Labov thought of as the ultimate way to elicit unconscious, unmonitored speech. And when we reflect on it, it's actually perhaps the least likely to elicit unconscious, unmonitored speech. There's also a problematic conflation that we recognize now between assuming that casual speech was necessarily non-standard speech. So it's of course possible for you to speak casually with someone, but yet do so in a relatively standard way. And you do this all the time, for instance, in university settings, where you're talking to someone, a colleague whom you've worked with a lot, and yet talk in a fairly standard way with them. So you're casual, you're comfortable, perhaps you're talking about fun things, topics like what you did on the weekend, which should elicit natural speech, but your natural casual speech can still be relatively standard given your audience. By contrast, the opposite is also possible. It's possible to talk in situations in very non-casual ways, yet still be non-standard. So my personal example that I always think of in this context was my time in the Army, which of course is a in many ways hyper-masculine, masculine normative sort of organization, where I couldn't help but be conscious of the sociolinguistic evaluations of language that I was using, and in particular, it could be damaging to speak in ways that are associated with being academic or intellectual or highfalutin or non-physical, overly cerebral, all these ways that we talk in academia that are problematic in those spheres. So I would often be in situations where I was speaking in a highly formal situation, a briefing, giving orders to subordinates, but I would still need to speak in a way that was relatively non-standard, relatively non-standard in a prescriptive sort of way, and actually not even very close to my normal sort of discursive practices, because I was adjusting my language to the people I was speaking to and to the norms of the speech community that I was working in. So Labov inherently equated the vernacular with casual speech and casual speech with non-standard usage, and we know that it is possible to talk in casual settings but be standard, and to talk in non-casual and formal situations but to do so using non-standard practices. So all that is to say, your critiques of the vernacular that have probably occurred to you as you've engaged with the early research projects of sociolinguistics and mid-20th century dialectology and these foundational approaches, you've rightly recognized problematic elements of those. And undoubtedly, there are problems in Labov's conceptualization of the vernacular. Nevertheless, the core goal of getting unconscious speech, trying to elicit people talking without trying to shape their language according to external norms for what they think is right, or consciously manipulating the style, consciously manipulating the degree to which they're changing the way that they talk according to external norms and according to language ideologies, so that we can see how those ideologies, those external norms, interact with their language. That still remains fundamental research methods and goals across sociolinguistics and dialectology, and nowadays most linguistic fields in general. As a result of that, there have been a range of approaches to trying to capture the vernacular that go beyond Labov's methods of the rapid and anonymous survey or the sociolinguistic interview. And what's particularly important to note is the tradition, the exceptional tradition of some work in surreptitious recording in sociolinguistic and dialectological work. Murray and Murray reviewed the legality of surreptitious recording, and Tom Murray in particular was an advocate for using surreptitious recording as a way to overcome the observer's paradox. Murray conducted a number of research projects where he wore a recorder and then talked to people, asked questions without disclosing that he was recording them and without disclosing that he was a researcher conducting linguistic research. Indeed, he would often directly lie to people, and in many cases he describes being confronted and coming up with excuses for why he was asking, that he thought he knew them from previous school, or he was a worker, or many other sorts of excuses. Now, whether or not to record surreptitiously in linguistic fieldwork is not currently an open debate. The field has moved unanimously and categorically against practices of surreptitiously recording. The Linguistic Society of America has explicitly condemned it, and of course, national laws like research codes of practice in the United States, or of course GDPR in a European Union context, have explicitly codified conventions against any kind of recording that violates a person's ability to choose to participate in research, and more importantly, to choose not to participate in research. This is captured in a U.S. context under the research ethical requirements of respect for person, beneficence, and justice. And respect for persons codifies the value that people must have the option to opt out of research and not be forced into research. It's useful, though, in thinking about surreptitious recording as a response to the observer's paradox, to note that actually surreptitious recording doesn't, as a practical matter, work very well. So typically when you try to record surreptitiously, you get really bad results. An epitome of this was in Crystal and Davies' 1969 effort to record groups of children. So in that study, a play area was constructed for teenagers, and then there were secret microphones all over the place. As creepy as that sounds, it was also useless, because what you got was a lot of sounds of ping pong being played, people shouting at each other, shoes squeaking on the floor, and that kind of thing. So it was garbage data. Nevertheless, though, again, in thinking about the observer's paradox and contextualizing different types of sociolinguistic research and different types of dialectological research as efforts to navigate the observer's paradox to move away from consciously monitored speech, we can actually problematize a number of studies that don't get problematized that often. For instance, in Labov's work in New York City, a number of people that he contacted to interview on the basis of the sociological survey that he used to identify informants, a number of them declined to be interviewed. In that work, he posed as a repairman and knocked on their doors and asked them some questions just to get them to produce some of the variables that he was interested in. He didn't record these encounters, but he did, in this way, get data from people who had declined to give data, and I think there's no question that today that would be forbidden by an ethics review panel. Leslie Milroy's work in Belfast during the Troubles has been foundational to establishing network theory and understanding how individual involvement and participation in social networks drives language change. However, in her work, where she was embedded in these speech communities in Belfast for long periods of time, she acknowledges that it was frequently the case that people would forget that they were participating in a study and just talk. Indeed, this is one of the points of ethnographic research. You become embedded in the speech community and people sort of forget that you're a researcher and forget that you're not one of them. And if we're problematizing surreptitious recording, if we're problematizing interviewing someone and recording them without their being aware of that, which we should, it's problematic. It's hard to draw the line at the point where someone forgets that they're being interviewed and continues to give you data and call that okay. I can say, again, in my own experience, I have a Kansas City interview where I was interviewing a boyfriend and a girlfriend together. And at one point I did get up to take a call on my phone, and once I went back and transcribed the interview, during that phone call, the girlfriend was complaining to the boyfriend about how long the interview was taking, and saying that she really needed to go, and she was kind of being compelled to stay by her boyfriend. When I got back to the interview, they both giggled. I thought in the moment that it was because I was such a compelling and interesting person, which of course I should have doubted. And only once I transcribed the interview realized that they had forgotten that they were being interviewed, forgotten that they were being recorded, and then when I came back and re-engaged them, they remembered that, which led to the giggling. So in moving toward the observer's paradox, there's this more complicated space about how we navigate what participants know, what they're conscious of at different times, and this is part of our navigation of ethics as we deal with sociolinguistic data sets, as we deal with dialectology, and as we try to navigate between people speaking in their vernacular language as we've problematized, and potentially adjusting their level of attention to their speech. All this is done in recognition of the observer's paradox and creates a number of issues that we need to navigate and be intentional about our positioning of ourselves toward as researchers and as people using the data of our informants. Since Labov's work, a number of interview methods have also been developed, and I put interview in scare quotes here because they demand that we reconceptualize the way that we think about an interview. But fundamentally, I would suggest that these different methods are all united in their goal of overcoming the observer's paradox. So interview dyads are where two people are interviewed together, or even better, two people interview each other and neither of them is a linguist, with the idea being that in talking to each other, they're talking more naturally than they would if they were being interviewed by a third party who's unknown to them. Group activities are sometimes used where you have bigger groups and they're engaged in something fairly casual where they're not thinking about the fact that they're being interviewed. Ethnographic studies where a researcher is embedded within a community either as a participant observer or as an observer and can be forgotten, and enough time is given so that a natural sense of interactions and community life can emerge. Similarly, ethnographic studies are sometimes conducted at sort of the individual level. So there are research projects that have engaged with a small cohort of speakers over many years, and over that process of many years, the relationship between the researcher and the informants becomes so natural, and the task of being interviewed becomes so natural that the observer's paradox is lessened. And indeed, in some of those studies, the informants will actively contribute to data by recording themselves in diaries and journals and that sort of things. We sometimes use speech recorded for non-linguistic purposes. So this can be media speech or other interviews, as we'll work with in future weeks. So, for instance, speech collected for oral history projects will not have the observer's paradox in the sense that because the topic is not language, in the Labovian context, where the problem of the observer's paradox is the person realizes their language is the topic of study and therefore changes their language. If a person is being interviewed for some other topic, they'll be thinking about their history, their personal experience with relation to the topic of the interview, but not necessarily monitoring their speech because they know that language is the domain of study. And then finally, we can consider speech-like texts, things like social media posts that mimic speech but are not exactly speech, as potentially unlinguistically self-monitored, relatively conscious genres of speech that we can draw on as interviews. So the fundamental observation here remains. Since Labov's work, whether we're thinking of ourselves as sociolinguists or as dialectologists, our objective is to capture natural speech or to manipulate the ways that people are thinking about their language so we can understand different interactions between their language and a range of social or cognitive factors. There's a problem with the way that that's been labeled historically of the vernacular in its way of equating vernacularity with non-standardness, with casualness. These are problematic concepts that we need to continue to interrogate. Nevertheless, in recognizing the goal of achieving a study of unmonitored speech or achieving an understanding of speech and language at different levels, we can shift the domain of language, and we come up with methods that recognize the role that we might play as observers in influencing the data that we're collecting, and develop and navigate different methodological approaches to attempt to reduce the amount of influence a researcher has on the research that they're conducting. And as such, knowing about the observer's paradox remains an essential part of our knowledge as linguists, as sociolinguists, and as dialectologists, as we understand the ways that our work might be shaped by the observer's paradox and the way that in doing our work we might need to try to navigate to avoid the observer's paradox.